Hi, welcome back to Jeff's Cave of Cool Books. My name is Jeff, and today I want to talk about one of the treasures in my collection. Now, I don't have a lot of, very valuable books in my collection. I have a few, and one of those I'd like to share with you today. It's valuable to me for a couple of reasons, not just its scarcity, but also how I got it. And a good friend gave it to me, which I'll talk more about later. Mostly I'm content with cheap paperbacks and reasonably priced hardbacks. I love both of those. I don't usually care about what kind of, if it's a super fancy edition necessarily, as long as I have the content in a decent format. But I do want to talk about one particularly pretty nice book today, and it's Worse Things Waiting by Manly Wade Wellman. Now, Manly Wade Wellman was a dark fantasy writer. He wrote a number of other things. He wrote juvenile fiction and some nonfiction and, pulp sci-fi and other types of tales. But what he's most well known for these days are his dark fantasy and horror stories. And I have here my little section of my bookshelf dedicated to Manly Wade Wellman, trade paperback and mostly hardback. Some different editions that I've been lucky enough to collect over the years. And I also have a few paperbacks in my collection as well. But today I'd like to talk especially about this book that was put out by Carcosa Press in 1973. Now, Carcosa Press was a small publishing house that was started by the dark fantasy and horror writer Karl Wagner. Okay, well, let's take a closer look at this lovely hardback, Worse Things Waiting, published by the aforementioned Carcosa Press. Now, I mentioned that Karl Wagner started this small press, and he also did this with two other individuals. One was a man named Jim Groce. I'm not 100% sure if I pronounced his name correctly, but Groce. And the other was another fantasy writer who was a friend of Manly Wade Wellman, and that was David Drake. Now, David Drake recently passed away, I believe it was last year, probably predominantly known for his military science fiction works, but he also produced lots of historical fantasy and sword and sorcery, and even a very fun collection here. It's very much inspired by Manly Wade Wellman, who was a good friend of his. This is the Old Nathan collection of stories by David Drake, and I highly recommend this one as well. And in the front of the book, he has a dedication to my late friend Manly Wade Wellman. So Drake and Karl Wagner became friends with Wellman later in his life, and he was one of the ones that they wanted to focus on in their limited small press. They only published 4 books, 4 collections. This one, Worse Things Waiting, was the first. Then they released another Wellman collection, Lonely Vigils, that was a collection of Wellman's John Funston stories, which luckily were later collected in one of these Nightshade Press editions. And then 2 more collections of stories by Weird Tales authors, Farland's Other Days by E. Hoffman Price, and Mergenstrom and Others by Hugh B. Cave. And that was the last, that was the limit of what they published, unfortunately. But I will say about this one, Worse Things Waiting, published in 1973, this collection of mostly Weird Tales stories and mostly standalone, for the most part, not part of one of Wellman's series of monster hunters or occult sleuths or detectives, which he's probably mostly noted for, but mostly standalone horror stories, as I mentioned. Anyway, this won Wellman the 1975 World Fantasy Award. So that led to a career resurgence, and Wellman began writing a lot more supernatural fiction, including several more novels, 5 more in the Silver John series, 2 more featuring John Funston, a collection that's quite rare, unfortunately. All of Wellman's books are pretty rare these days, sadly, but called The Valley So Low, and his final novel, which was a historical novel called Kahena, and that was published shortly after he died. Now, in this book, let's take a look at this. Like I mentioned, this one is special and for several reasons, one of which is that it's fairly rare. There were only 2,800 and I believe 67 copies published. Yes, 2,867 of these were published, and of those, 536 were pre-signed by Manly Wade Wellman and the artist Lee Brown Coy. Now, Lee Brown Coy was famous for one of the most prominent Weird Tales cover illustrators, as well as interior art. And he was approached by Karl Wagner to illustrate not only the cover, but the interior of this collection. And as you can see on the back, here's a nice photo of Mr. Wellman, manly in action here. A manly man for sure in real life by all accounts. And in the inside flap of the slipcover, there's a photo of Lee Brown Coy, the artist. Now, for ease of description and showing you this, I'm going to remove this book from its slipcover because it might be a little crinkly and a little hard to show you everything. So under the slipcover, of course, have nice hardcover with some nice red gilt lettering of the title here. And now I'm going to come to two of the things that make this particularly special. The first is this is one of the signed editions. Now this was pre-signed. It wasn't signed live for me or whoever previously owned this book, but it did have, and I'm assuming the other 536 or 535 had this inset card, again with art by Lee Brown Coy, and you'll see there Manly Wade Wellman and Lee Brown Coy's signatures. Now we come to the other key point which makes this very special to me, and that is inlay card. Now this card was put in by whoever owned this book originally, and it does say their name, and it was a part of their library, but eventually it must have been sold, perhaps after that person's death, because it shows that he died at 1986, sadly, fairly young man, and it eventually landed in Henderson's Books, a very impressive used bookstore that used to be in Bellingham, Washington State, up near the Canadian border. Whether it's still there, that bookstore is still there now, I'm not sure, but a good friend of mine, one of my best friends from 7th grade on, Clayton Kelly Walter was his name, and he was working, at least part-time, at this bookstore. He was aware of my love of Manly Wade Wellman. He loved him too, but he especially knew that this was a writer that was particularly important to me, and he very kindly purchased this book. It wasn't particularly cheap at that time. I believe he paid around $200 at that time, which was in 1997, and he inscribed under this card of the previous owners. He had a little space here, and he wrote a nice message to me here and dated it 1997 and signed it. And that particularly is important to me because my friend is no longer with us. He passed away, sadly, about 4 years ago, and he was a really good friend and obviously thoughtful and kind, and that's partly why I treasure this book. Now let's take a little look inside here. So try to show you some of the cool Lee Brown Coy art, some of the very interesting and eerie and strange art. And here we have a list of some of the works of Manly Wade Wellman, and the frontispiece here. And again, you'll see the Carcosa imprint and publication 1973. They really did a nice job in binding and laying out these books. A list of all the credits of where they obtained these stories. And then a nice little memo there, or acknowledgement, dedication, I should say. In affectionate memory of Farnsworth Wright, Seabury Quinn, Malcolm Jameson, and Auguste Derleth, When musing on companions gone, we doubly feel ourselves alone. Nice little dedication there. And then into the illustrations and contents page. And I'll just show you a little bit of the art in here. We have a foreword by Manly Wade Wellman, dated May 21st, 1973, from Chapel Hill. At this time when Carl Wagner and David Drake were putting together, and Jim Croce were putting together Carcosa Press, they were also in Chapel Hill, Carolina, North Carolina, and so that's also the area or the address given for the small press, Carcosa Press imprint. And then we have an introductory poem and some more nice art. Again, I guess nice is perhaps the wrong word. It's a little bit weird and freaky, but that's the way we like it. And again, there's quite a few full-page art pieces as well as, little end smaller illustrations here. Can you guys see that all right? And, nice strange buzzard there, or whatever that's supposed to be. And again, this is very fitting for the story, Frog Father, which is sometimes considered a prototypical Silver John story. It's narrated by a young person who's, goes through an ordeal. He doesn't have, the kind of vernacular that Silver John uses, and he's never named, but, some critics have said that this is perhaps a slight precursor to what would soon come later for Manly Wade Wellman's most famous character, John the Balladeer. Let's see, just a few more. I'll show just a few more interesting little pieces of art from Lee Brown Coy. Scattered, again, quite a bit of art all through this nice edition. Quite kind of gruesome and discomforting sort of art that adds a nice vibe to these supernatural tales. Most of these are a little darker fantasy and horror stories here. And of course it comes to an end with a nice little final illustration and with a French, I should say Latin perhaps, inscription. And then some information on the book. And then finally, once again, the Carcosa Press imprint. Now, the stories in here, as I mentioned, they're kind of divided into some different sections. We have the first section, pages from a memory book, which are some, some of the more, I guess you would say, Appalachian sort of horror stories and fantasy tales. We also have quite a few that are not only relegated to America, but we have some that are set in the South. Devil is Not Mocked, a pretty famous tale set in, I believe, Transylvania during World War II, and some other locations there. And then we have a third section, which is mostly called The Night Side of History, again, which also has their more historical tales, including some that are featuring Native American lore and Native American characters, including A Young Man with Skull at His Ear, and The Liars in Wait, and The Hairy Thunderer. And finally, the closest that we get to any sort of recurring series characters that were kind of part and parcel of a lot of Wellman's supernatural fiction come at the very end, longer in the telling. And there are two stories featuring his character Bible Jagger. Now, Bible Jagger was a sergeant in the Civil War, a Union sergeant, and after the war he becomes a preacher and he fights evil in the first of these. And these are two longer works, two novelettes. Fearful Rock was the first appearance of Bible Jagger, and that's set mostly in, some of it during the Civil War, and then most of the rest of the story, the rest of the novelette is set after the Civil War, when Bible Jagger returns to Fearful Rock area to fight a group of Satanists that have infested the area. Then the final story in this collection is called Coven. And of course, as you might infer from the title, Jagger, in this case, this is set during the Civil War, this one completely. He fights an evil witch and her companions, her cohorts. There was a later Bible Jagger story written after this book came out, once Wellman's dark fantasy career kind of resurged, and that's called Toad's Foot, and that's collected elsewhere. Anyway, just a little look inside this cool collection, and it's one that you can find out in the wild, but it's not particularly cheap, you know. And now, both Worst Things Waiting and Lonely Vigils were reprinted in trade paperback form by a few years ago. I believe it was 2018, but sadly those are also out of print now. And I wish I would have taken the time to pick up Lonely Vigils, even if it was in trade paperback form. I never did get a hold of that one or the other two Carcosa Press books, but very glad to have this one added to my Wellman collection, which I will go through and talk about in more detail at another time. But for now, thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you again.